Caroline, as someone talking a bit about myself for a moment who is very interested in social justice and policy, it strikes me that you have a great and very interesting job. As this is my first time to talk to you on radio, could you start off by telling our listeners about your job?
Yeah. Well, I'm head of social justice and policy in the Society of St Vincent de Paul, and we're the largest charity of, I suppose, social action and concern in Ireland. And there's kind of three elements to the work that we do, and a lot of people will be very familiar with the Vincent de Paul locally, where we're, carrying out visits to people in need in their homes and trying to help them to get back on their feet. So that's kind of the first two things that we do. We provide support and friendship, and we work with people to become self-sufficient and get back on their feet. And the third part of what we do then is our work for social justice, and that's where I'm coming in. And I suppose, the Society is 175 years in Ireland now this year. And one of the things that we are trying to do is not just respond to the immediate need of people on the ground, but also to look at what's going on for people there and look for the kind of social change that's needed to bring about a fairer society for everybody, not just for people who are struggling, but, a fairer society that everyone can enjoy living in. And that's really what I'm doing. So, we have 11,000 volunteers every week who are out in their homes. And a lot of the time they'll see social justice issues. So they're going to see things, people who are at risk of becoming homeless. They'll see people who are maybe living in very poor quality accommodation that can't afford to heat it, or that it's, not worth heating because the insulation is so bad. And we see people who can't access education. So whether that's children, maybe the cost of education is too heavy a burden for their parents, or whether it's, people who want to go back and take advantage of lifelong learning, but they can't do that because of a lack of support. So those are some of the social justice issues. And one of the big ones that we see then is poverty. And that's the big overriding one that has kept the society going, I suppose, in Ireland for the last 175 years. People living on low incomes and having to go without basics like food, like heating, like the kind of right clothes for the right seasons and all that kind of thing. So really, I suppose that's, we're challenging those injustices based on the experience of our members working with people in need.
I know you're an international organisation. Is the international organisation 175 years old, or is in Ireland 175 years old?
So we started in France, and that's where the Vincent de Paul started. So it's around in France a little longer. We're 175 years in Ireland, which is one of the longest ones. I'm not too sure. One of the other countries that the Vincent de Paul is big in is Australia. Now, I don't know off the top of my head how long they're going in Australia, but I suppose the Irish one is one of the longest in existence.
I hope to maybe come back to you towards the end of the year to do an interview on Air FM talking about your anniversary, Okay, to move on to the biggest reason we are doing this interview today, Caroline, the local and European elections are taking place at the end of May. Could you tell us what you and the SVP are calling on local and European candidates to do?
Yeah, well, I guess, as I said, poverty is such a big issue for the people that we're assisting and for our organisation. So we're trying to, firstly, I suppose, raise awareness of poverty as a real issue among our elected representatives. Now, politicians do get a very hard time, but I guess one of the things that we see is, in their constituency clinics, they're often working with a lot of the same people that we are with the same problems, housing difficulties, low income, unemployment and things like that. But what we're really saying, I suppose, to our European candidates is, look, will you prioritise poverty in Europe? Tackling poverty in Europe has to be, a priority for them. We have the Sustainable Development Goals that commit us to, eradicating poverty in all its forms by 2030. So we're asking the candidates, what are you going to do to try and make that a reality? We know that there's, 85 million people across Europe living below the poverty line, and almost 800,000 of those are living in Ireland, and that's a lot of children as well as that living in poverty. So I guess that's what we want to see the European candidates dealing with.
Okay, we'll come back to the European candidates in a couple of minutes. To talk a bit about the local candidates, to talk a bit about housing, it strikes me that a lot of people in Ireland are cynical of the government's approach to housing. Would you, would you as in the SVP, share those concerns?
Yeah, well, I suppose what we feel is, we're in a housing crisis. We need to start making some of the right decisions. Now, we know that Rebuilding Ireland is the government's policy for addressing housing and homelessness. We feel that it is going in the wrong direction. It relies very heavily on the private rented sector to meet social housing need. And if anything has come across in the last number of years, we know that the private rented sector is not a suitable place for people who are on low incomes to be expected to make their home for life, if you like. So that's one of the big things that we will be driving for, a change in the direction of our housing policy, where we start ramping up the delivery of real social housing by local authorities and by charities like the Vincent de Paul and Respond Include, who are approved housing bodies. Because that's the kind of housing that people who are vulnerable and people on low incomes and even people on sort of average incomes who cannot afford to be living in the private rented sector, that's what people need. So really housing is the big issue for us in the local elections.
Okay, just two more questions about the local elections, and we talk a bit more about the European elections. It's great news, isn't it, that Regina Doherty, the Minister for Employment and Social Affairs, has said in the last few months that she is planning to bring in free school books for primary and second level students. It's great news, isn't it? Do you agree?
Yeah, well, we would. Look, I mean, the cost of education is one of the big things that our members would see, and that's something that we raise again and again. And a number of years ago, the Department of Education brought out a circular that said to schools, let's have a more sensible, cost-conscious approach here for parents. Why are people being asked to pay for uniforms with crests on them? Why are there not more book rental schemes in schools? You know, what can be done to have a sensible approach to costs in schools? But that hasn't been implemented. And so one of the things that we are looking for from the Department of Education is the implementation of that. Now, schools are kind of, work very much independently from the department. So all the department seems to be able to do is advise them. But again, we're hearing from schools, we're hearing from parents, I suppose, who are getting letters from schools that are saying, I need to pay a booking fee for my child to return. I need to pay for the book, even if it is a book rental scheme, I have to pay for the 3 years up front, which can be like, up to €300. For somebody on a low income, that's absolutely insurmountable. It gives a child and a young person a very negative impression of the education system. So more absolutely needs to be done. We would very much welcome free school books. I suppose we kind of wonder where the Department of Education would fit into that. If it's the if it's the Minister for Social Protection that's making these announcements, like where does the Department of Education come in? Because it actually is their responsibility. And something that we're very concerned about with that Department of Education as well is the underfunding of schools. So schools are under tremendous pressure. They are on the front line. They are, dealing with all the issues, I suppose, that we're seeing. They're seeing homeless children. They're seeing parents struggling on low income. But the schools themselves are underfunded. And then the school is looking for, a voluntary contribution from parents because the school does not have the finances to actually provide a school place for every child that's there. And that's coming back on the parents. But again, we know that an awful lot of parents can't afford it. But sometimes the parents, even who can't afford it, are the ones who are least reluctant to put up their hand and say, look, it's voluntary and I'm not paying it, because I suppose they don't want their child to be singled out as different.
It's unbelievable what's happening in a lot of schools. I think it's great that about there's free school books, but I think it should include uniforms as well, yeah?
Yeah, the uniform costs are huge, especially for things like crest, jumpers with crests on them and PE gear that's all, school colours and all the rest of it that can't be bought maybe in any of the kind of cheaper stores. If there's just one shop that supplies them, that's a problem for parents as well.
I've done a couple of interviews with Bernardo's on this topic over the last few years. Are there any other specific policies that you would like to see local election candidates commit to try to end poverty in Ireland?
Well, I suppose one of the other concerns that we have is to do with energy poverty. So about 28% of households in Ireland are struggling with the cost of energy. And that, I suppose energy poverty comes about when people are either, any of these three things really, on a low income, facing high energy costs, and maybe living in a home that's badly insulated. So when those three things come together, people are struggling with energy poverty. It's a big thing that we see in St. Vincent de Paul, and energy costs have gone up by 30% since 2010. So that's why people are struggling with the cost of energy. So one of the big problems that we have is that housing, needs to be upgraded, and that's social housing and that's accommodation in the private rented sector as well. There's a good bit of, I suppose, support for homeowners who want to to improve the energy efficiency of their home. But for people in private rented accommodation, and we're seeing obviously more and more people on lower incomes in the private rented sector because of that direction in housing policy, those people can't access any supports to make their homes more energy efficient. So they're spending a lot of money on energy and effectively heating the sky because it's going out through the roof because there's no insulation or insufficient insulation. So the quality of our housing stock is the other thing for the local elections as well. That's certainly an area that we see. I mean, one of the things that we'd like to see is community energy advisors being rolled out across the country that would help people maybe who are in social housing or in private rented accommodation to, I suppose, improve their energy use, because we need to all reduce our energy use because carbon taxes are going to be increased. The environment needs to be protected. If we want to address our climate concerns, we have to improve our energy efficiency, because people do need to use energy. They need it to be affordable, but we do need to make sure their homes are energy efficient as well. So there's lots of kind of things that could be done. That's another very local thing. Local trusted community energy advisors, which can advise people about their energy use, point them in the direction of grants and things like that so that they be supported, and help with the practical things like clearing out an attic. Because if you're looking at an older person, maybe living on their own with very little family support, clearing out the attic might be an insurmountable barrier, but that's a very easy thing to solve once you know about it.
To move on to the European elections, as we already mentioned at the start of the interview, the SVP is an international organisation. Do you have a cross-EU campaign or manifesto calling on MEP candidates across the EU to commit to with the EU elections being held?
Well, we actually don't have something across Europe. We're kind of, I suppose we could probably do a bit more in terms of work with our colleagues in other European countries. And at the moment we don't have anything like that, but I suppose what we're looking at is our candidates north and south of the border and trying to see what they can do if they are elected to the Parliament